In this tutorial, we're going to look at how you can take a set of vectors and using the modelling tools in the software, we'll look at creating components from simple raised profile shapes to more complex swept shapes. Once we've created the model, we'll then look at how we can calculate toolpaths in order for us to cut that out on our CNC machine. So let's just close this down and then we'll go and open an existing file. So I'm going to select the FleurDelys.crv3d file and press open. So here I have a set of vectors that were already drawn using the drawing tools in the software. To help me see the shapes that I'm going to create from these vectors, I'm going to come over to the 2D view control and use this option here to tile the windows. That way I can see the 2D view on the left and I can see the 3D view on the right hand side. If I come over here to the layer drop down manager, I can select the drop down menu here, we can see that we have data across two layers. We have a weave and a dome layer, and we also have a FleurDelys layer. The FleurDelys layer is currently switched off and I can switch that on by selecting the light bulb, and we can see now that that layer is now on and we can see the vectors that are within that layer. And so the layer manager is a smart way for me to organise my 2D data. I'm just going to switch the FleurDelys layer off for the time being. We're going to look at the weave and dome. We can see these vectors here. We're going to use these to create shapes, to create the base shapes of our model. Once we've created those shapes, we'll then switch on the FleurDelys layer and then we'll look at modelling the shapes that form the FleurDelys that will sit on top of the base shapes. So let's just switch the FleurDelys off for the moment and we'll close that manager down. In order for me to create shapes, I need to come into the Modelling tab. And this is where I can access all the tools to create shapes. So as I said, we're going to start by creating the base shapes of our model. So to help me in advance, I'm going to rename level 1 by right mouse clicking using the option to rename the level, in which I could just type in a new name. I'm going to call that base and just click in the space here to deselect that, and any components that I create now will be added to my base level. So the first shape that we're going to create is going to be a basic dome shape. We're going to use this oval vector here to create a dome shape. So the tool we're going to use is this one here, the Create Shape from Vectors. And by selecting that, this allows me to assign a profile with a specified angle to the closed vector that we've got selected here. So I could choose from a curved profile, an angled profile, or I could choose a flat plane profile. In this case, I'd like to create a low dome, so I'm going to use the curved profile here. We then need to specify an angle, and so I could just use the slider bar if I wanted to. We can see at the bottom that that's calculating that, and we can see the result of that profile and the angle that we've got set here in the 3D view here. If I just put that in isometric view, and then if I wanted to, I could just adjust that, or if I wanted to be a bit more specific, I could just type in an exact value here. So I'm going to put in a value of 20 degrees, and we should see that update in the 3D view. And there are various other parameters that we can use in order for us to control this shape. I'm going to call this component dome, and then I could go ahead, press apply, and then we could just go and close the form down. We can see now that I have the dome component added to my component tree. If I select that, we can see it selects the grayscale in the 2D view, and it also selects the model in the 3D view over on the right hand side. So for the next shape, the weave, we're going to use a modelling function called extrude and weave. And that allows me to select one or more vectors to act as drive rails, in which I then assign a cross section to extrude along those rails. So I'm going to go and select this vector group that we've got here. And then we're going to go into the extrude and weave tool, and it's the third icon across in the modelling tools. I'm going to select that, and that's going to open up the extrude and weave form. And with those vectors selected, we're going to use the option here to use selection, and this tells the software that I want to use these vectors as the path that I'd like to extrude a shape along. The shape that I'd like to use as the cross section to extrude along these rails is this vector here. So we can see that cross section there, so I'm just going to select that. I'm just going to zoom out a moment, bring that into view, and then we're going to go and press apply. And so we can see that's automatically been updated there. And if I just zoom in on the 3D view, we can see that we've created that shape. However, we're not really getting a weave effect, and that's because we haven't got the weave under and over crossings selected. So if I just check that, and then we're just going to go and press apply, you can see that's now updated, and we now have this weave effect that we can see here. So we can see that this is a very powerful modelling feature that we've used there, and we can see that we have a rather complex looking model here using a simple set of vectors. So here I could go in and put in a name, so I'm just going to call that one weave, and then we'll go ahead, press apply, and then we can close that down, put that in isometric view. And we can see that that weave component has now been added into the component tree, and it's adding on top of the dome. And we can see the result of the weave being added on top of the dome here in our composite model in the 3D view. And the component tree allows us to keep all of the shapes we create organised. If we needed to, we could change the order or the combine modes of our components to get the desired effects within the 3D view. So what I'd like to do now is crop the shape of our dome to the outer edge of the weave that we just created. So to do that, I'm going to select the weave. We're going to use this option up here to create a vector boundary from selected components. And that's going to create a vector based on the silhouette of the component. And so if I just click here, we can see that vector there. Now I'm only interested in this outer vector here, so I'm just going to look at deleting the other vectors that were created then. And to do that, I'm just going to come over and just ungroup those vectors, and then I'm going to hold down Shift and select that outer vector so that it's deselected, and then we're just going to use the delete key to delete all of the other vectors that were there, and we're just left with this outer vector. So now I can take that dome shape, I could hold down Shift and select that outer vector, and we're going to come over and use this option here to clear area of selected component outside selected vectors, and that's just going to remove everything outside of that vector. So now I'm happy with the shape that we've got there. And we've now finished modelling the shapes that form the base shapes of our model. So I'm just going to minimise this level here, and I'm also going to switch that off. I'm going to right mouse click on the base level and then use the option here to insert a new level, as we're now ready to go and create the components that will form the FleurDelys that will sit on top of our base level. Again, let's rename level 1 by right mouse clicking, use the option here to rename level. We're going to call this level FleurDelys, and any components that I create now will be added to the FleurDelys level, and they'll ultimately be added on top of the base shapes that we just created. So let's just go into the layer manager down here in the layers tab. I'm just going to switch off the weave and dome, switch on the FleurDelys, and I'm going to select that to make that the active layer. Go back into the modelling tab. We're now ready to start creating the components that will form that FleurDelys. And we're going to start by creating the middle of our FleurDelys. So I'm going to select that vector. You can see it's a closed vector. I'm going to come up to the modelling tools. We're going to use this option here to create shape from vectors. So again, I'm going to assign a profile, so I'm going to go with a curved profile. I'm going to put in an angle of 60 degrees. We're going to set the combine mode of that component to merge, and then I'm going to name that component. We're going to call that middle, and then press apply, and then we can see it's been updated in the 3D view. We can close that form down, and then we can look at modelling the side of our FleurDelys. In this example, we're going to look at using the two-rail sweep. So the two-rail sweep requires me to select two vectors that we're going to use as rails, and then we select a cross section or a series of cross sections that we'll use to sweep in between those vector rails. So let's just go over to the two rail sweep option. So it's the second icon in the modelling tools. You can open up that form, and the first thing we need to do is select our drive rails. So I'm going to go and select our first vector here. I'm going to hold down Shift and select this vector here. And I'm going to use the option here to use selection, and let's transform those vectors into drive rails. The next thing I need to do is select a vector that will act as my cross section. So I'm going to use this vector here. And I'm just going to go ahead and just press apply just to see how that looks. And if we just zoom in on the 3D view and we can take a look at that, we can see that cross section being swept between those two drive rails. We have an option here to scale the cross sections with width, and if I select that, what that will do, where the two drive rails come close together, the shape will be lower, and where the two vector rails are further apart, the shape will be higher. So it's just going to scale the cross section with the width of the two vectors. So with that checked, let's go ahead and press apply, and we can see that's been changed there in the 3D view, and you can see that we've got a more natural looking part. I can see that it's currently adding on top of that middle shape, and that's because the combine mode is set to add here. So I'm just going to change that, set that to merge. You can see now it's blending in with the middle shape. I could go and rename that shape, so just going to call that side, and I could go ahead now and press apply, and then we could close that form down. To create the other side of our fleur-de-lis, I'm simply going to take what we just created and I'm going to create a mirrored copy. So with that selected, let's go over to Transform Objects. We're going to use this option here to mirror selected objects. We're going to flip that about Job Center. We're going to create a mirrored copy. We'll use this option here to flip horizontal. We can see that's created the mirrored version on the other side. Let's just close that down. I'm just going to pop that in isometric view. So the last shape that we need to create for the fleur is the tie. So we're going to select these two vectors here by holding down Shift, and we're going to look at using the two rail sweep again. So with those vectors selected, let's go over to the two rail sweep form. We're going to use this option here to use selection. Now this time, rather than using one cross section, we're actually going to apply two cross sections to this. I'm just going to zoom in a little so you can see that a little bit better. And I'm going to take this small cross section here, I'm going to select that, and I'm just going to attach that to the drive rails there. I'm also going to take this larger cross section here, and with that selected, I'm going to apply that to the middle here. And so we're going to start with this small cross section on the left hand side, and then it's going to transition into this larger cross section here, and then it's going to transition back to that small cross section that we've got there. And so using that larger cross section in the middle is just going to lift up that shape in the centre area of that tie. If we go back to the form, you can see that we currently have scale cross sections with width checked. I'm just going to uncheck that, as I do not want to do that. I have these vectors specially created in order for me to create the desired shape that I'd like. I'm going to come over, we're going to set the combine mode of this tie to merge with the other components. I'm going to name that, I'm just going to call that tie. We could go now and press apply, and we can see that's been updated. Let's just close that down. I'm just going to maximise the 3D view, and we'll just take a look at that tie there. And we can see that small cross section on the end transition into that larger cross section, and then going back to the small cross section on the right hand side. And so there's really no limit to how many cross sections that you apply when using the two rail sweep function. And so this is a very powerful way for us to create lots of different shapes. And so when we created that shape, you can see we've got these rounded edges here. What I'd like to do is just look at softening the edges. You can see it looks rather flat there, and that's because of the cross section that we use. So to help me achieve more of a smooth finish on the edge there, I'm going to look at using the sculpting tools. So I'm going to take that tie there, and we're going to use the sculpting tools. We're just going to look at smoothing the ends over, and this is a powerful way for us to edit a 3D model. So we're just going to go and use the smooth option here, and I'm just going to click over that, and we can see that now that I'm clicking, I'm just really softened that edge off there. And I could go into the twiddle view, I could just move that view across, go back into the smooth, and then again just by using the left mouse button I can just dynamically smooth the end of that component. Let's just put it in isometric view, and just use the twiddle tool just to zoom in so you can take a look at that. You can see that I have, as well as the smooth option, I can smudge, and there's various other options I could deposit, remove, and I could look at using the undo brush. And so using these options I can treat my model like a virtual piece of clay. And so I'm happy with the tie there, so I'm just going to use the option here to keep and then press OK. Put that in isometric view. So now we've completed the modelling stage in this example. So if we switch on the base level, we can see the overall composite model that we've got there. Within that last level that we created, the FleurDelys, you can see that this level consists of 4 individual components, and so this is a very powerful feature of the software in that we can work with individual pieces that are simple to model to create a much more complicated collection of parts to create this overall composite model that we can see there in the 3D view. And so now we have a part that we can go and calculate the toolpaths on. Before we do that, I'm just going to check the height of the overall model. To do that, we're going to use this option up here to scale the Z height of the model. And so here we can just check the height of the model. We can see it's just over 0.46, and that's based on the parameters that we used when we modelled this part. And in here what I can do is I can very precisely set the height of the overall model by using this option here to set an exact height. So in here I'm just going to alter that and make that 0.45, press apply, that will update, and then we can close that. I'm going to OK that, so now we have a composite model that's highest point is 0.45. So let's just go and tile our windows, and I'm going to go into the drawing tab and then go into the layer manager here and just switch on the weave layer, as I need this vector here in order for me to use as a boundary for my cutout toolpath when I go to create my toolpaths. So now that we're ready to create our toolpaths, let's just hide our design panel on the left hand side and switch over to the toolpaths tab using this option here to switch to toolpaths tab. You can see now it's opened up the toolpaths tab on the right hand side, and the first thing that we need to do is set up our material. And so this is where we relate our virtual setup to the actual physical setup on our machine. So we'll start by looking at the material. So we're going to set Z0 off the top of the block. Material thickness we're going to work with 0.625. My XY datum position, I'd like that to be in the lower left hand corner. Then we move down and look at the model position in relation to the material block. Here I could just simply use the slider to position that where I'd like that within my material block, or if I wanted to be a bit more precise I could type in specific values. For instance, I'd like to have a gap above the model of 0.05, so I could just type that in and then it will automatically update the gap below, so we can see that we're going to have an 1/8 of an inch material as stock below our model. Move down, look at the rapids and our home and start position, make sure that they're safe enough for the tool to clear any clamping mechanisms that you may have in place, and then we could just go ahead and press OK. So we're going to start by looking at the 3D roughing toolpath, and this allows us to hog out the majority of the material with a larger tool to make it safe for us to come back and go in at the detail with a smaller tool. So let's just go in, it's this icon here, the 3D roughing toolpath. And so what we need to do here is we need to start entering parameters for the toolpath, and we'll start by selecting a tool. So if we use the select option here, that's going to open up the tool database, and this is the area of the software where we can enter and edit any tooling that we have available to us with appropriate parameters for our particular machine and materials that we're planning to cut. In this case, I'd like to use a 1/4 inch end mill, and I could go ahead now and press OK. Then we move on to the machining limit boundary, and this is where we specify the area that we'd like to machine. In this case I have 3 options. I could choose the model boundary, and so it's just going to take the boundary of our model and use that in order to govern the area that we'd like to machine. Or I could use the material boundary, so it's just going to take the entire material and we'll use that in order to govern the area that we'd like to machine. Or I could use the selected vector. Now, as we created that outer vector from that weave, I'm going to use this option here as I already have a vector that we've created. So I'm going to select that vector and ensure that selected vectors is also selected. We then move on to the boundary offset, and so in here I can specify a value that I'd like to offset our toolpath to. Now at the moment we can see the vectors coming right up to the edge of our model, and in order for me to cut down the side of the model, it would be good for me to put in a very small boundary offset so that the tool can come a little bit past the vector in order to cut down the side of our weave. In this case I'm just going to go a little bit larger than the radius of the tool, so I'm just going to put in a value here of 0.18. Then we move on to the machine allowance. So this is where I can put in a value in order for us to leave a skin of material that would be left on the part to make sure that we avoid the chance of the roughing toolpath chipping at the part and ensure that we have some material left to cut with the finishing tool. So we're just going to go the very small allowance of 0.03. Then we move on to the roughing strategy. In this case I'd just like to Z-level. We're going to raster that, and then we can move down and I could give that toolpath a name. So I'm just going to call that 3D roughing, and then now we could go ahead and press calculate, and the software will calculate the toolpath, and once it's calculated it, it will display the toolpath in the 3D view, and it automatically opens up this preview toolpaths form. And this allows us to animate the toolpath in a virtual piece of material so that we can see exactly what it's going to cut when we run it on the machine. So let's just go and preview that toolpath. The software will just take a moment to run that, and we can see the result of what we're going to cut when we actually run that. So we can see that there. If you're happy with that, you could go ahead now and press close. So now we can go and run our 3D finishing toolpath. So that's this icon here, the 3D finishing toolpath. And again, we need to select our tool from the tool database. So let's use this select option here. That will open that database up. And I'd like to use a ball nose in this case. In particular, I'd like to use the 1/8 inch ball nose. And so we can see that that's just a rounded tool there, you can see from that image. So I'm going to go ahead now and press OK. Machine limit boundary, again I'm going to use that vector that we created earlier. We're going to have a small offset, again a little bit larger than the radius of the tool, so I'm just going to go with 0.1 in this case. I'm going to raster that, I'm going to call that 3D finish, and we could go ahead now and press calculate, and that's just going to take a moment for the software to calculate that toolpath, and then it will open up that preview toolpath form. Okay, so you can see that there. Let's just go and preview that toolpath. We can see that being animated there in the 3D view. And so I could go and maximize the 3D view and just take a look at that a little bit closer. And this will give me a good idea of what this will look like when we actually cut that out on the machine. And so this preview is very important, as if it doesn't look right here, then I need to go back and change my calculations. So the preview function allows me to save wasted time and material when I do my actual cut by verifying the results of that cut first. And so looking at this, you can see that I am fairly happy with the detail and the finish that I've got here. So now I could go ahead now, close that. Let me just go to view. I'm going to go and tile my windows. Now we're going to look at running a toolpath in order for us to cut the model out of our material block. In this case we're going to use the profile toolpath, so we're just going to use a 2D toolpath here. So I'm going to select that, see that I already have my vector selected, which represents the boundary of that model. Then we just need to check some of the settings in here. So the start depth, we're going to make that 0. Cut depth, we're going to cut all the way through our material, so let's put that 0.625 in there. The tool, I can see that I already have a 1/4 inch end mill selected there, so I'm just going to keep that. If I wanted to, I could use the edit option here just to check some of the parameters and alter those if I felt that I needed to. I could just go ahead now and press OK. Then we move on to machine vectors. In this case, I'd like to machine that outside of my vector boundary that we've got selected here. I can move down and see that I have various other options that will enable me to control this toolpath a little bit better. If I wanted to, I could add tabs just to hold the part in place if I didn't have an appropriate hold down system in place. In this case, I'm just going to assume we have an appropriate hold down system, so I'm not going to add tabs in this case. We'll move down to the bottom of the form. I'm just going to call that profile, and then we could go now and press calculate. So we can see that toolpath there. If I just go and preview that toolpath, if we maximize the 3D view, if I wanted to, I could just double click on the waste material and that will just remove that for me. So now I have a good representation of what our carved part should look like after we've run these toolpaths that we've calculated. So at this point, if I'm happy with it, then I'm ready to output this data and send it over to the CNC machine. So to do that, I'm just going to go and press close here. And then we select the tool that we want to output by clicking on that. I'm going to come over to the Save Toolpath option here. And what we need to do is select an appropriate post-processor from this drop-down list. So this will format the data for my machine tool or for the control software I use to drive my machine tool. In this case, I'm just going to go the standard G-code. I'll go ahead now and press Save Toolpath, so to give that an appropriate name. Then I could go ahead now, just save that, and now I have a file that I could go and put on a thumb drive or send it over across the network and actually do the rough and cut on the CNC. I could then go and select the Finish toolpath and save that out. Now if your CNC supports a tool changer, then you'd be able to output these as a single path that you'd be able to run on your machine, and it would automatically change the tools in between each one of those. So we'll just go and save that one, save that as 3D Finish, press save, and then we'll do the same for the profile. Let's just close that down. So you can see how we can take a set of vectors and using the modelling tools in the software, we're able to build up components, everything from simple raised profile shapes with a closed vector to more complex swept shapes using 2 rails or a single rail, and even having the ability to weave those shapes together like we did here when we created the border. Once we created the finished model, we then saw how easy it was to set up our material for machining and run the toolpaths to cut that out. And having the ability to preview our toolpaths means that we can review how the part will look before we cut it out. This will save us time and material stock. And so that concludes this tutorial. Thank you for watching.